Chapter 7 Stavanger and the Pedro Gorino. I spent the rest of my youth in securing an education in the arts and sciences of the sea. My quest for knowledge and adventure took me to the ends of the world. It was a strenuous, tragic, and terrible part of my life. Often I was at the mercy of heartless men, but through travail and toil I still retained in the back of my mind the story of the full moon and her sorry cargo, and I determined some day to start a campaign based upon the eternal truth that a race without ships is like a man stricken and blind. I would instigate a movement to rehabilitate Africa and found such an Ethiopian empire as the world has never seen. It would be greater than the empire in Haiti, for while that island kingdom, with its Toussaint Louvertures and Christophs, produced great palaces and forts and armies, battalions strong enough to whip the best soldiery of France, yet the island itself is a mere pinpoint on the earth's surface compared to the great continent of Africa, where I planned to build my empire. It would be greater than the empires of Africa's past, such powerful nations as those who raised their enormous stone structures at Zimbabwe and elsewhere. For although these kingdoms must have numbered their subjects by the hundreds of thousands, their store of knowledge was limited. I dreamed of an empire infinitely more cultured. Africa could again lift up her head. Her fleets would sail upon the sea. Her resources would once more enrich her own children. I dreamed of downfall for the imperialist, those wolves from the Zuiderzee and the slums of Whitechapel. Fortunately for my project, I met Captain Forbes early in life. He became my patron and sponsor just as Clarkson and Wilberforce had been Paul Cuffey's. To him I attribute what I possess of the higher reaches of nautical science. He it was who taught me the theory and technique of international maritime practice. Captain Forbes looked something like Sir John Fisher. He was slender and dark-skinned with a Norman profile. He was quick and accurate in conversation, devastating in debate. We became great friends as our views were all in harmony. He was a humanitarian and a universalist with the good of the whole world at heart. I was no less a humanitarian, but my particular object was the betterment of the Ethiopian race. Before I could even begin to help my people, it was necessary to secure a ship. One day Captain Forbes came to me with the news that Count Thiessen of Norway, one of his very good friends, had just such a ship as I had been seeking. It lay at anchor at Stavanger, Norway, and it was necessary for us to journey there if we wished to make arrangements for its purchase. We took passage on a steamer bound for Norway. There were 3 of us who went up to Stavanger: Captain Forbes, Sidney Wilson, and I. I had found Sidney Wilson sitting on a park bench in Leicester Square, London. He was raw-boned, Bayesian, shiny, black, and as strong as a bull. I could tell by the cut of his jib that he was as true as steel. He had run away from his ship after having been badly treated. He told me about his troubles in his deep musical West Indian brogue. Been sailin' since I was pickaninny. Seen some billows. Never seen mate like de mate on dat ship. Dat buck of a Maine tink I'm a fool. He whipped me. I knock him down and run away from ship. I determined then and there to take him with me if I found a boat. Before many weeks had passed, I was to find that he was a fearless sailor and an excellent cook. As we three traveled northward aboard the steamer, we watched the northern lights, which until this time I had never seen in such brilliance. As we approached the coast of Norway, we sat transfixed at a magnificent scenery. Neither Sidney Wilson nor I, in all our travels, had seen these fjords and cliffs and snow-capped mountains. The water was blue and clear. The land seemed clean and unlittered. On the hilly meadows cattle grazed. Here and there dark forest came down to the sea. But more miraculous than all else were the mountains that were not mountains at all, phantom hills and cliffs through which the eye could penetrate to valleys and green pastures beyond. Before we realized it, our journey was over and we were at Stavanger, Norway. We found the little city quite as clean as the hilly meadows along the coast. The fishermen's cottages, with their quaint gardens, were bright and colorful. I was impressed with the gentility, refinement, and quiet culture of these people. They seemed positive but just, deliberate but intelligent, people who could understand the realities of life, yet with men among them who could dream as well as any. The day after our arrival, we went to the offices of Thesson and Company. The Count himself was in South Africa, but his agent made us welcome and told us about the boat. We all went down to the dock together. The water was crowded with fishing boats and small craft of every kind. One among them seemed as proud as a swan in a flock of wild geese. She was the ship we hoped to buy. I have sailed aboard many boats in my life, but not one was as graceful as this. She was a freak topsail schooner rigged to carry a great mass of canvas. She was some 70 feet long, with the lines of a greyhound. She had what is known as a pink stern, a stern almost as high and pointed as the prow, giving the boat an unusual symmetry, and although her two masts were bare, I could picture them with white canvas bellying in the wind. We took a skiff and went aboard. We examined her from stem to stern. She was the worthy product of the sons of the Vikings, and as strong as the day she was launched. Her strakes and wales were of oak, staunch enough for a man of war. When I went into the hold, I found the keelson of enormous strength, as were the garboard's strakes. The way things were, shored and braced, would have delighted any sailor. Every point in the whole boat where there was any stress was made of oak. She had been given such good care. She was really better than new. She was a seasoned boat. We found no defects in the stays or shrouds, clamps or yards, and although we searched for rot with our pocket knives, we could find none. Above all, she was beautifully and newly copper-sheathed. I realized from our examination that she would hold herself to a course and carry sail without lying on her side. The name on the prow was almost obliterated by the weather, so we hunted up her log. The name was the Pelar Guri, and beneath the name was a page of illuminated script, which Captain Forbes translated. It ran something like this: In the early part of the 15th century, Norway was under the sway of independent robber barons. There was one tyrant who became so cruel and greedy that the people drove him from the land. He escaped to Scotland, where he bribed a Scottish chief named Sinclair to assist him in conquering Norway. Together, these schemers gathered a huge army and descended upon the unsuspecting Norwegians. There was a peasant girl named Pelar Guri living in one of the valleys. With great courage and spirit she rallied all the peasants of Norway and drove the robber and his hirelings from the land. From this united effort rose the kingdom of Norway. The boat had been named for this heroic girl, and the figurehead was a fine representation of her strength and beauty. Sidney Wilson, who was a West Indian and who had been under Spanish influence all his life, misunderstood the name, however. He thought we had said the Pedro Gorino. He was a clever man, with the brush, as most sailors are, and several days later he took it upon himself to paint the name on the prow. He led me proudly to the dock to show me his handiwork. "But that isn't her name," I protested. "Her name is the Pelar Guri." "Pelar Guri? No name for black man's ship," he replied, and he looked so dejected when I suggested changing it that I said no more about it, and Pedro Gorino she was from that day forth. I attribute to Captain Forbes all my success in this deal for the Pedro Gorino. He arranged such liberal terms with Thesson's agent that I took a new lease on life. Before the week was out, he had solved another of our problems. The ship was without sails, and he had found an extraordinary bargain. We went up to see the sailmakers in their loft. There were a dozen old salts sewing away on canvas for all they were worth. The light fell upon them from little windows opening out over the sea. Ah, there was a scene for a great master, the light falling upon those old men and the character in their faces. Captain Forbes could talk Norwegian, and most of the men could talk good English, so we understood each other very nicely. When they heard my story and found that I was going out to South Africa, they informed us of an extraordinary coincidence. They had, in another loft, connected with their organization, 16 young men who for several months had been preparing to go to South Africa to seek their fortune. They were all young sailors, and it came to my mind that they might be willing to man the ship and sail her out to Cape Town for their passage. We met the young sailmakers later that afternoon, and they were eager to accept our terms. Consequently, we drew up a contract, with these people purchasing the gear and sails, and arranging for the exchange of the services of these young men for their passage to South Africa. The next day we opened ship and commenced to take in stores. There was practically no repair work necessary, but we gave the boat a thorough inspection and overhauling. Within the scheduled time, the sails were aboard, and the crew was ready for the journey. They were as fine and clean-cut a bunch of boys as I have known. There were 15 Norwegians, 1 Scotchman, Sidney Wilson, cook par excellence, Captain Forbes, and I. One of the Norwegians, Captain Carlson, was a very experienced mariner, so I made him my first mate. We took aboard the last of our 100 tons of cargo and luggage and prepared to up anchor. The next morning we made our departure and plotted a great circle for England. The North Sea was choppy, and we hit rather rough weather during the first part of our trip. It was cold and rainy, with leaden-colored skies overhead. The Pedro Gorino responded to our every touch, and proved herself a fine, seaworthy little ship. In several days we sighted the lights 80 miles northeast of London, and were soon in the Channel. We shaped our course due west by south with a favorable breeze, and finally dropped anchor at Southampton. I was very sorry to have to leave Captain Forbes, but our parting at Southampton was inevitable, as his business held him in England. While we were at anchor, he gave me literally tons of useful cargo, and dozens of nautical instruments. Among his gifts were sextants, books, charts, and maps, 3 fine solar chronometers, 2 side-reel chronometers, a 4-inch telescope, and a muzzle-loading salute cannon. The cannon proved to be not the least serviceable of these, and on one occasion saved us from a real catastrophe. The captain went with us as far as the Lizards, the point where ships leaving England make their departure. We had a sorrowful parting, and he promised to come to South Africa within a year. When he could accompany us no farther, he hailed a pilot boat and stepped aboard, leaving me to the great task we had planned together. We plotted our course in a great circle from the Lizards to Funchal, and went bowling along, piling up knot after knot. Far out on the wild Atlantic, we had no thought of the Biscayan tides, but were surrounded by porpoises even before we came to cloudless Madeira and the Pearl Tenerife, set as they were in a sea of glass. The Scotchman aboard our ship was a great storyteller, as were 1 or 2 of the Norwegians. The weather was fine, and there was little work, and much time for games and stories. I remember one story the Scotchman told, the name of which was all about Jonah and his voyage in the belly of the whale. It is a raw story, and one to which religious people might take exception, so for the sake of discretion I had better not relate it. The Scotchman, however, had no such scruples. He would say, "Hootmon, that's na story. Listen to this one," whereupon we would receive another deluge of his racy narration. He knew most of Bobby Burns by heart, and his favorite poem was, "Ye flowery banks, O bonny Doon, how can ye bloom sae fair? How can ye chant, ye little birds? And I say, fu o care." Finally we made landfall at Madeira, and dropped anchor at Funchal. Here we took on water and provisions, and I invested the rest of my money in Madeira, lace, and carved furniture of rare woods, which I knew I could sell at a profit at Cape Town. Soon we made our departure, and putting up every bit of rag we could carry, sailed day after day ahead of a light but favorable breeze. We passed the peaks of Tenerife, off the coast of Rio de Oro, and after uneventful sailing sighted St. Vincent in the Cape Verde Islands. So far we had encountered good weather, but one morning the sun arose, red-yellow, and we knew we were in for a storm. We shaped our course due south under full sail, trying to miss its path and sail out of danger, but by noon the wind had slackened until the ship scarcely moved through the water. By mid-afternoon there was not a breath of air, save for an occasional puff from every quarter, which only served to make the sails flap idly where they hung. A haze began to spread over the ocean. This, and the peculiar color of the sky, told us more plainly than words what to expect. We put things in ship shape, and waited. We must have lain becalmed over an hour, laboring for breath in the hot, sultry air, the ship rolling quietly on the glassy water. Suddenly we noticed a disturbance in the haze several 100 yards off. Our starboard. Then out of the ocean arose a great water-spout drawn higher and higher by a powerful wind, which whirled like a corkscrew. The great column of water, 100 feet high, was headed for the ship, and came down upon us at an enormous rate of speed, but the wind that brought it did not fill our sails, and we lay helpless, directly in the path of the oncoming disaster. I had once been aboard a ship when a small waterspout passed near, throwing tons of water over the midship and taking several men from their feet. I remembered how the ship had staggered under the impact, and in the second I had forethought, I realized that this great column of water rushing down upon us might easily send us to the bottom. Then, in the nick of time, I remembered the advice of my old Uncle Silius. If a spout comes at you, shoot it with a gun. It'll fall same as any living thing. Our salute cannon, mounted on the bow, was always filled with shot and powder. I rushed to this, and aiming it at the oncoming pillar of water, fired. The waterspout broke at less than 50 yards from the ship, and poured back into the sea like a waterfall. We were very thankful for our deliverance. Within a few hours a breeze sprang up from the port quarter, and we got a splendid run all the evening. We sighted St. Paul on our port some days later, and continued to sail day after day through an untroubled sea. We plotted our course southeast, and piled up knot after knot of southern latitude. As we approached St. Helena, the weather grew squally, but we would not shorten sail. We passed outside the island, only sighting her hills. The menacing sky kept us on the alert, but the splendid stiffness of Our Lady Pedro Gorino held to her course, and would not give an inch, but instead gained to windward, and mounted the waves like a Guinea goose. At last we sighted Table Mountain and the Lion's Rump without mishap or accident, having made our reckoning to the second of a degree. Thus we came to Cape Town from Stavanger, Norway, in 71 days, on the good ship the Pedro Gorino. Chapter 8. Cape Town, a Somali prince, and a Texas cowboy. When we dropped anchor in Table Bay, we found the harbor crowded and with warships and transports. South Africa was in the throes of the Boer War. We might have been in quarantine for many days, but the agent of Thesson and Company arranged to secure us pratique, and we were soon ashore. As I stood on the dock looking back across the bay, the Pedro Gorino seemed very small and helpless among the great men of war. I had no trouble in selling my cargo at a profit and paying Count Thesson the balance I owed on the Pedro Gorino. The Count was Consul General for the Kingdom of Norway, but I found him to be a very democratic and unassuming nobleman. Shortly after my arrival, he invited me out to his beautiful estate. I have forgotten the name of the place, but it was Norwegian, and was designed to embrace the concept of a view of the sea, the mountains, and the forest. After an enjoyable weekend, we returned to Cape Town together. All along the peninsula we passed estate after estate of English gentlemen, among others the estate of Cecil Rhodes. But not all the inhabitants of Cape Town were of the caliber of the Norwegian Council. Ever since the old Dutchman Van Riebeek and his motley crew of Hollanders stole South Africa from the Hottentots, there has been race admixture. This was true to such an extent that when I was in South Africa, classification was by rule rather than by nature. Much to my surprise, and despite my protest, the authorities insisted upon classifying me as European because of my European training and my light color. Strange to say, the authorities and the inhabitants disagreed, which put me in the wrong light with all factions. I was suspected of social climbing when I mixed with the European colonials, and suspected by the government of ulterior motives when I mixed with my own race. I realized the danger of my position, but I had decided to make Cape Town my headquarters, and I was not to be easily dissuaded. I realized that the Cape was the most strategic point in that part of the world, and was bound to become as important as the Golden Horn in ancient times. I realized also that while I was awaiting my chance to help the Ethiopian race, I could not do better than locate in the very midst of the imperialists and learn their game at first hand. I had some difficulty in finding an office for my shipping business, but finally, through the assistance of Frater and Elliot, I was able to locate on the Strand. There was a coffee house on Hanover Street, a typical English coffee house, 2 steps up with little green tables and a silver urn for making cocoa. It was run by an Africanado, a congenial old fellow. It was here that I picked up some of my best friends, men who were to play an important part in the next few years of my life. Here it was that I picked up a new crew to replace the Norwegian who sailed the ship to Cape Town. Among the first were Peter Benjamin and Will Braithwaite from Barbados. They were both intelligent fellows and just the sort I was looking for. One evening, some 2 weeks after my arrival, I went as usual to the coffee house for my evening meal. At one of the tables sat 3 strangers, one of whom was colored. By their accents I knew that they were Americans. I was so elated to see Americans again that I said in a rather gruff voice, "What are you boys doing around here?" The colored fellow seemed to sense hostility in my voice. "We ain't askin' nobody no questions," he answered, glowering darkly. "I'm an American myself," I explained, "and it's seldom enough one meets a man from home in this part of the world." "Well, if you wasn't meanin' to insult us, let's shake on it the big Negro suggested. It was perhaps well that I had ignored the challenge in the first words he had spoken, for I was to find that Kid Gardiner, the colored fellow, was a two-fisted buck from Texas with a six-shooter and a long knife. That this cowboy was also a good sort was not so obvious. These men had come to Cape Town on a ship from New Orleans, carrying stores from the States for the British government. Being rovers, they wanted to see more of the war, but they were out of money, out of whiskey, and out of sorts with the world in general. I offered them the hospitality of my ship until I started trading again, and tried to dissuade them from trying to get through to Kimberley. Kid Gardiner accepted my offer, but the other two were tired of Cape Town and declined with thanks. The Kid and I became great friends, and I found that although he was a desperado, he was chivalrous at heart. One warm evening, as we sat outside the coffee house looking up at the bright heavens and talking of the 1,001 things sailors and adventurers talk about, we saw a little group of Cape Malays across the street talking earnestly. An old frequenter of the place pointed out one of them and said, "That's Haji Hassan, the richest Mohammedan in South Africa." I was interested and asked about the man. I found that Hassan was a mysterious figure. No one knew how he made his wealth, or what he had done to be so powerful among the Mohammedans of South Africa. But everyone knew that he was powerful. Rumors varied. Some said he was a Somali prince. Some said he was a quiet Arabian scholar and a very religious man, having made frequent pilgrimages to Mecca, as his given name would indicate. But everyone agreed that there was something uncanny about the man. He was said to know every important turn in the war, even before the papers. He had inside information on all the unsolved crimes. My informer pointed to a short, wiry man by Haji's side. "That is Hamid Abdurrahman, one of Haji's right-hand men," he said. Later in the evening, the Kid and I had a chance to meet Haji and Hamid. They strolled nonchalantly across the street and acknowledged the introduction with a slight bow, although they had been quite out of hearing all the evening. I had a strangely apprehensive feeling that they had heard every word of our conversation. Hamid would not have attracted a second glance, but Haji was one of the most striking men I have ever seen. He was a princely-looking black-skinned fellow, tall and strong, with a handsome, intelligent face. His lips were thin and well-formed, his nose slightly aquiline. His most striking feature, however, was neither the thin lips nor the long, slender nose, but his eyes, which seemed to glow like the eyes of a great cat. Once or twice before I had seen such eyes, the iris encircled with a yellow ring, the pupil dark and piercing. I knew that I was dealing with no ordinary man. I was interested. The Kid was hypnotized. In the days that followed, Haji and I became friends, but Haji and the Kid were soon thicker than thieves in a mysterious business, the nature of which remained unknown to me for some months. Several days later, Haji Hassan left town for Kimberley on a protracted visit. Before leaving, however, he made Hamid Abdurrahman vouch for Kid Gardiner's discretion and conduct in the interim. Haji realized that the Kid had the type of temper that might lead him amok at any time, and because the Texan was such a valuable man, Haji was taking no chances. Further, to secure matters, he asked me to help Hamid if anything went wrong. The kid no longer needed my hospitality, but he still needed my friendship. The day after Haji's departure, he came aboard the Pedro Gorino to make me a visit. The ship at this time was employed in hauling fishing boats up and down the peninsula. As we sailed eastward, the kid and I talked together. He seemed to have fallen into miraculously good fortune, for as he sat beside me on the deck, he smoked an expensive cigar and waved bediamonded hands. I asked him to tell me about Haji Hassan. "He's a straight-shootin' sort," the kid confided. "He's the sort I like to get connected up with." Then he told me almost all he knew about Haji, but I knew there was something he was keeping from me. It seems that Haji had been a prince among the Somalis, but, discontented with his role, had decided to see more of the world. After going to Mecca and making his Hajj, he became interested in the city of Aden, where he had gone into business with Khawaj Dinshaw, whom I had met as a boy. Often he would travel up and down the coast of Africa and of Arabia as Khawaj's special agent. On one of these trips he learned of a diamond rush in South Africa. Like hundreds of others, he hurried to the region about Kimberley. He never returned to Aden, nor to his people, the Somalis. As the kid sat beside me telling Haji's story, it seemed quite natural that the absolutely fearless, handsome, mysterious Somali should have taken a fancy to the recklessly daring, brilliantly foolhardy Texas cowboy. I was piqued to know their game. However, this the Texan refused to reveal, becoming suddenly cold and quiet at my question. Early one morning, several days later, as I was standing upon the dock, I saw Hamid Abdurrahman hurry toward me. He seemed troubled. "What's the matter, Hamid?" I asked. He was so breathless that all he could say was, "Allah have mercy." Finally, he recovered enough to tell his story. He and Kid Gardiner had been walking up Caldon Street on the previous evening, and having passed through the Mohammedan district, had proceeded into the European section of town. As they were passing a pub, the kid had suggested that they go in and have a drink. Hamid, knowing that there would be trouble if a colored man entered a European saloon, tried to dissuade him. The Texan, however, was not to be dissuaded. He swaggered in through the half doors and up to the bar. Hamid, knowing the unwritten law of Cape Town, and being a Mohammedan and an abstainer, remained at the latticed door of the saloon, prepared to give what aid he could if worst came to worst. The kid ordered ale and was served by the barmaid. Hamid drew a long breath and waited. There were a number of Englishmen and Boers in the bar-room, but the Texan drank his glass as leisurely as if there were no one in sight. Then he ordered a pint bottle of whiskey. The proprietor, who had just noticed him, said to the barmaid, "Hold on there, girl. What's the meanin' of this? You trying to insult me?" the kid asked. "Get out, Swartz," the proprietor shouted. The kid's voice was like steel. You trying to class me with your Cape Town niggas. I'm from Texas, and I ain't to be tampered with." The proprietor grabbed for a bottle, and the kid prepared to jump over the bar and finish the argument in the only convincing way he knew. At that moment, however, a new element entered into the fight. Two British Secret Service men, who had been sitting at a nearby table, jumped to their feet and threw themselves upon the Texan. The proprietor, fearing he would hit one of the Englishmen, did not throw the upraised bottle. The kid threw them off, and with a sharp left hook sent his first assailant reeling to the floor. The second drew a gun, which the Texan deftly kicked from his hand, disabling several of the Englishman's fingers. At this moment the proprietor threw his bottle. The kid ducked, but it nicked him on the side of the head before it crashed against the opposite wall. By this time the first man was on his feet again. He raised a chair high above his head and brought it down with all his strength upon the Texan. It was a blow that would have killed the ordinary man, but Kid Gardiner, superb fighter that he was, sank slowly to his knees, still retaining enough consciousness to draw from under his belt a long, wicked-looking knife. As the two Britishers jumped on the fallen cowboy, he lashed out left and right, cutting the man who had knocked him down from the ear to the tip of his chin, almost taking his jugular vein. At this point, some 2 or 3 minutes after the kid had entered the bar-room, little Hamid Abdurrahman rushed in and tried to defend his charge, but the excited crowd, who had double-banked and almost killed the kid, took no notice of the small figure of Hamid. A moment later, officers of the law poured in from the street to quell the tumult. They took the kid to jail, half dragging, half carrying his cut and bruised body. Hamid had searched for me all over town, but despite his frantic efforts, it was not until the following morning that he had found me to tell me the story. I decided that there was but one chance for the kid. We must establish the fact that he was American by birth, and secure the aid of the American Consul. I hurried immediately to the Consul's office. He was an anemic old man from Kansas. I have forgotten his name. He said that he had been a railway conductor, but he looked more like a retired farmer to me. He was so illiterate that it was only with the greatest difficulty that he could spell out a letter of introduction to the chief of police. The letter safely in my pocket, I hurried to police headquarters to request a pass for the Consul and for me, so that we might see Kid Gardiner where he lay in jail. The chief of police, who was a great fat bear with a fair command of English, read and reread the letter until I thought he must be trying to memorize it. Finally, he looked at me over his glasses and grunted, "You want a pass?" I said, "The letter speaks for itself. Give the Consul one, not you." "Suit yourself," I replied, trying to seem calm. He called his clerk and made out a pass. I immediately carried it to the Consul. He stared at it rather blankly and said, "Oh, yes, the pass. I'll see him one of these days." "Don't bother," I said, at last losing my temper. Whether or not the kid was in the right, and I have always held that he was, since he was fighting in self-defense against uneven odds. I was determined to do everything within my power to help him. I wished desperately that Haji Hassan had been there. But since he was not, and since the American counsel was quite useless, I prepared to handle matters as best I could. First, I went to a big store in Cape Town and instructed one of the clerks to get Kid Gardner's order, fill it, and send me the bill. Satisfied that he would have good clothes and food until the day of his trial, I went and saw my barrister and solicitor, men I had retained for my sea business. They agreed to take the case, and there was nothing to do but wait the unhappy day. The prison camp at Cape Town is called the Breakwater. I could not bear to think of the kid serving a term within its cruel walls. I have seen prison systems the world over, but nothing worse than the one in South Africa. Through their effective court system, British politicians impress great hordes of men, both guilty and innocent, into back-breaking work on the breakwater and in the quarries. They doubtless gild their own pockets with the money saved on construction costs. Great numbers arrive from the region around Kimberley to serve long sentences for having been caught with uncut diamonds in their possession. For, no matter how honestly a native comes by one of these stones, even if he were to find it in his own kraal, he is certain, if discovered, to serve a term on the breakwater, occasionally a life sentence. The natives are quite unable to defend themselves in the courts, and almost every one accused of a crime is convicted. These poor fellows are dressed in white duck to create an illusion of humanitarianism among outsiders. To one who knows the real condition, the dress is sinister. When I was in Cape Town, this subtle form of slavery still existed, long after outright slavery had been abolished throughout the civilized world. Was it any wonder that I wished to save my friend, to have his free spirit and adventurous nature cooped within prison walls was like clipping the wings of a brilliant cock, or harnessing a stallion to the plow. Finally, the case came to court. The kid was given 4 years. I could do nothing but accept his fate. Chapter 9. A Tramp Ship on the Indian Ocean. It was not long before I had gathered together a good crew. Sidney Wilson, my cook and steward, came out with me from England. He stayed with the Pedro Gorino from first to last. Captain Peter Benjamin, my first mate, was from Barbados. He was the last colored man to graduate from the Liverpool Nautical College, and a very competent and dependable mariner. In many ways he reminded me of the boatswain on Traveller II, for he had no neck at all, was short and heavy-set, and was as black a man as the world has ever seen. He was every bit as kindly and as generous as the boatswain had been, but he was a great deal more intelligent. Will Braithwaite, my second mate, was also from Barbados. His grandfather had been a recognized poet on that island, and he had a touch of the poet in his nature. One of the family traditions told of English nobility in his ancestry. However that may be, his color was light, and his features slightly Caucasian. He had an English university education, and spoke as gently as a woman and as perfectly as the Prince of Wales. His nature was the most complex and paradoxical I have ever known. Despite his apparently gentle ways, he was the toughest sailor and the greatest fighter I have ever met. He did not drink, but he was always broke. He seemed to like his work aboard ship, but he was the first man to go ashore when we reached port. On shore he wore a Prince Albert coat, a tall silk hat, and neatly creased trousers. He always carried a cane. He wrought absolute havoc with the ladies. The rest of the crew, with the exception of 4 native Africans, were from South America and the West Indies. They were a good crew, and they took a particular interest in the operations of the ship. Because of a profit-sharing plan I instituted aboard the Pedro Gorino. Through the aid of Frater and Elliot, Thesson and Company, and several influential friends, on the dock I was able to arrange for a regular freight and passenger business. Much of the work on the dock and in Cape Town was done by natives who came from their home kraals under contract to labor for 3 to 6 months at a shilling a day. Contracts were continually expiring and new contracts being made, so there was a considerable flux of native labor up and down the coast. I made contracts to transport these men. We improvised a service for passengers by building a superstructure on the deck. Their quarters were very comfortable. On our first trip we carried 40 passengers bound for Port Elizabeth, East London, and Port St. John's, together with their luggage and a full miscellaneous cargo. Because of our Norwegian registry, and because of the extreme importance of maintaining our neutrality in those troubled times, we flew the Norwegian flag. We made our departure from Table Bay under a cloud of sail. I doubt if a more enthusiastic or adventurous crew ever manned a Scandinavian ship. We were dark brown Vikings on an African coast, ready for wind and rough weather. Yet, to the prosaic men with whom we did our business, we were nothing but a tramp ship on the Indian Ocean. The native passengers whom we had taken aboard had lived all their lives on a diet of milk and mealies, as if they had been children. Only occasionally had they eaten meat in their own kraals or at Cape Town. I had arranged to give them a regular board of trade fare. Sidney Wilson was an excellent cook, and his 4 meals a day were delicious. The natives, who were an unsophisticated lot, tried to gorge themselves at every meal. When they got over their seasickness, many of them showed signs of making good mariners. They learned a great deal about sailing in the short time they were aboard. It set me wondering why the British government did not encourage these people to lead a maritime life. Instead, it seemed that they did everything possible to keep them from the sea. We rounded Cape Agulhas, which is the southernmost point of Africa, and proceeded eastward along a rocky coast. Driven by favorable winds, we passed outside Mossel Bay and Kinsana, and at last dropped anchor at Port Elizabeth. This little city nestles in a great natural amphitheater overlooking the harbor. We found it very congenial. There were several fine churches, and a great municipal market here. To this market the Bear farmers drive their enormous wagons drawn by 16 oxen. With great shouting, creaking of wheels, and cracking of whips, These wagons lumber into town. At the market, government officials sell the produce for every shilling it will bring, charging the farmer but a small fee for their service. It was through this channel that the agents of Frater and Elliot had accumulated the cargo we now took aboard. There were leopard cheetah and buckskins, the hides of cattle and goats, and above all mohair and buchu leaves. We put ashore a cargo of hardware and dry goods, as well as several passengers bound for this port. Our trip from Port Elizabeth to East London was thoroughly pleasant, as the weather was warm and the wind favorable. We reached our destination and dropped anchor in the open roadstead early one morning. I remember that the beach was lined with great boulders, and unless a vessel had perfect ground tackle, it was in constant danger from southeasters. The lack of protection here made it doubly necessary for a ship to be well anchored, for if she were not, the wind might send her ashore to break on the rocks. There was a hulk within a few hundred yards of where we were anchored, and I became curious about it. Braithwaite knew the story of the wreck and told it to me. The ship had been an American bark, and she had come to East London with a valuable miscellaneous cargo of some 3,000 tons. She had completed her trading operations and was preparing to up anchor when a southeaster hit her. For a short time she held her ground, but as the wind grew stronger and the whitecaps lashed about her, and the waves came rolling over her, she began to drag anchor. All the people of the city had come down to the beach, but not one could think of any way in which they could render aid to the distressed ship. All that they could do was to stand along the semicircular beach, like the audience at a play watching the tragedy enacted to its bitter end. The crew seemed perfectly helpless as they stood there on the deck, watching the ship come nearer and nearer to the rocks, but when it had been driven within 100 yards of the shore, and it was only a matter of minutes until the final crash, the people had seen a small sturdy sailor throw off his shoes and shirt, tie a rope around his waist, mount the rail, and plunge into the raging surf. When his head came above, after the dive, the whole populace cheered. To swim in such a sea is next to impossible, but in some manner he had made the shore, bringing with him the life rope over which every member of the crew made his way to safety. The people had carried on their shoulders the sailors to their homes, where they gave them hot drinks and dry clothing. The ship and cargo had been lost, however, and the hulk lying in the roadstead was all that was left to commemorate the event. At East London I met Kirkland Soga, editor of one of the very few newspapers ever printed in a native African tongue. His mother was a Scottish missionary, and his father chief of a Khoiser tribe. His father had translated both the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress into Khoiser, and was the first native of South Africa to attract the interest of a biographer. The old chief's name was Teo Soga, more Japanese than African. Kirkland Soga attempted to explain it through an old tradition he had heard. The story runs that before the cataclysm, South Africa, Madagascar, Sumatra, Java, and even Korea and Japan were all connected by land, and formed a great, illustrious, and powerful empire. The people were highly cultured, the rulers rich and wise. When the great flood came over the land, it left only the remote provinces. However that may be, one may still find such Japanese names as Teosoga on the coast of Africa to this very day, because of our dangerous position in the roadstead. We were glad to up anchor and make our departure for Port St. John's, at the mouth of the St. John's River, which stream divides Pondo Land from the Transkei. As we sailed along the coast, I became entranced with the sight of high green hills rising obliquely out of the sea, covered with dense subtropical vegetation. The joy of the natives at seeing their own country again was quite moving. The forests and meadows we could see from the ship were so beautiful that I determined some day to visit Pondo Land. We were able to enter the mouth of the St. John's River, as the bar was about 14 feet and we drew but 11 feet of water. When we went ashore, we found Port St. John's quite a village. Although the population was small, the position of the town, situated as it was, is the only easily accessible pass through the hills for many miles, gave promise of greater development. Here a trail passed inland, following the banks of the St. John's River, and leading into the very heart of South Africa. The people of the port were both native and European. We put ashore the last of the passengers we had taken aboard at Cape Town, and received 50 natives of various tribes bound for the Cape. I then did some trading for myself, and we prepared to up anchor. The weather had grown cooler within the last few days, and we realized that we might expect bitter cold winds and rough going before we reached Table Bay. As we sailed southward, I began to figure what I might expect in the way of profits, and I came to the conclusion that if every trip were as successful as this one, my gross income for the year would probably exceed £10,000 sterling. We were out of port but a few hours when the wind began to freshen from the northeast. It sent us racing along with the clouds above us and the whitecaps on either side. We were exhilarated but hardly alarmed, as we were running almost ahead of the wind. The natives, in their improvised quarters, began to grow restless. However, they said, "Uyezi umoya, the storm is coming, see it rise. Awu ya lalamama, woe is coming upon us." Then one more deep-voiced than the rest brought quiet with his words, "In Gomta to, it is the law of God." The rough weather did not disturb Sidney Wilson. As he moved about the galley, getting our evening meal, he bellowed, a spiritual that could be heard from one end of the ship to the other. "I know Jesus am a medicine man. I know Jesus can understand. I know Jesus am a plate of gold. Gives you one swaller and it cures your soul." Then, as the spray from a big wave shot in through the open galley door, he began that mournful chanty, "I don't want to die in the storm, dear Lord. I don't want to die in the storm." As the wind began to shift toward the eastward, however, we all grew grave. We mustered the crew at their stations and battened the hatches. The barometer, which had been falling slowly all afternoon, now began to drop with alarming rapidity. Everything was shored and double lashing used. Up to this time the wind had been free, and we had been in little danger, but we seemed to have run into the vortex of the storm while trying to avoid it. "Furl topsail," I roared, and the first mate, port watch, lay aloft. "Furl the topsail," the answer of the port watch, as they made their way precariously up the ratlines, was blown back into their teeth, yet I could hear, "Aye, aye, the topsail." We continued to reef until we were running under nothing but the fore staysail. For perhaps 20 minutes we scudded along ahead of the wind, but as the wind continued to shift toward the east, we saw that soon we would be on a lee shore. "Port the helm," I shouted, and then a few minutes later, "Port the helm." There was nothing for it but to point up into the wind and sail as close to her as we could. To save ourselves, we had to run out to sea. Soon the rollers began breaking over the ship, flooding the waist and putting everything awash. Things were as tight as we could make them, yet the water came leaking into the galley, the cabin, and the forecastle. I was thankful that I had ordered double tarpaulins placed over the hatches. Now the lightning began to flash, and the thunder roar, followed by great bursts of tropical rain. During one flash I could see Braithwaite making his way aft with the greatest difficulty. He finally reached me and shouted in my ear, "There's danger of a panic among the passengers, sir." "Put a watch over them," I ordered. "Keep them quiet the best you can." Those 50 lives caused me great anxiety during the trying hours. The Pedro Gorino was a weatherly ship, and under any sort of sail would gain to windward. In this case, however, we had been forced to reef until she barely held her own. It was little wonder, for we were bucking not only the wind, but a strong ocean current that swings around the Cape from the Indian Ocean. Once the helmsman swept from his feet, or fatigued with labor, lost control of the helm. For a moment it felt as though we were tumbling over a building. Then, as we fell into the trough of the waves, the ship began to shiver and shake, as though she would open every joint and seam. We recovered, however, and proceeded to wear ship hour after hour. It was at this point that I became acquainted with the skillful seamanship of Peter Benjamin and the admirable qualities of the Pedro Gorino. The ship was overloaded, the mate tired and harassed, yet both proved to be of such a staunch, unyielding nature that even the onrushing sea, in all its mad fury, could not quench their courage. Before morning the rain had turned to hail, and the wind was bitter cold. We all suffered from the chill, but the natives, who were almost without clothes and in flooded quarters, probably suffered the most. We had a hard night of it, with all hands on deck. The sea ran high, and the sky was overcast. But through one small circular opening, where there were no clouds at all, we were aware of the distant stars, and the peaceful sky of midnight blue. Hour after hour, and day after day, we bucked wind and the waves. Occasionally we were able to take a half-hour's rest on our wet, cold bunks, but for the most part we were on duty all of the time. At last, after one of the worst trips in my recollection, we reached Cape Town, battered and bruised and fully aware of what we might expect in our future voyaging in that part of the world.